Hi, everybody. This is Josh Mansky with the Corn Belt Newsletter Podcast. I have the honor and pleasure today of having a friend and of, from Iowa State University, Matt Helmers, on the podcast today. Matt, appreciate you being on.
Oh, Josh, it's great to be with you and look forward to our conversation.
It should be a fun one. Uh, Matt, why don't you tell the folks who you are and what you do?
So I'm a professor at Iowa State University in our Ag and Biosystems Engineering Department and also director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. I've been at Iowa State University. It'll be 23 years on the faculty come August, I think August 4th. So really fortunate. Um, I've lived in Ames, I guess, longer than anywhere else in my life because I was an undergrad here in the early 90s and originally from Northwest Iowa. So originally from Osceola County, Sibley. Um, Grew up around there and spent a lot of time on my grandfather's farm. So people sometimes ask me, "Did you grow up on a farm?" And I'm very careful to say that I didn't. I grew up in town. So I can't claim that I'm a farm boy. I grew up in town. My dad was a family physician, my mom a nurse. So I broke the mold, didn't go into medicine, but I spent a lot of time at my grandfather's farm. I helped there and showed cattle. So I was around a farm, but didn't grow up on the farm.
Did your grandpa, was that a fairly traditional operation for the time?
It was. In fact, you can't see it there, but he was a master farmer back in the 80s. My uncle, my aunt's husband, was a master farmer more recently. But yeah, he when I was growing up, he had corn and soybeans, fed cattle, farrowed to finish hogs, and had some oats and hay ground. And then in the 80s, it was a time when he was, kind of getting close to the age I am now, and kind of got out of the livestock business at that time. It was, a point where he probably would have had to expand and maybe a little more challenges with labor. So he got out of that and just had corn and soybean production for kind of the rest of his career farming.
So you showed cattle.
Yes, yes.
Was that a 4-H project or?
That was 4-H, and I helped in college as well. In fact, spent a lot of time in Kasuth County because the gentleman that I bought cattle from or bought steers from the last couple years was in Burt, Iowa, so just north of Algona. So spent a lot of time driving when I was at Iowa State, driving from Ames to Burt, Iowa. And I always thought I was making good time, and every time it was 2 hours to get from Ames to Burt.
That's
So
exactly
uh,
right. That's how it
yeah,
works.
yeah, that's right. Every which way I'm like, oh, I'm making really good time, same time. So yeah, the late Kent Habiger that was up there and passed away
Mhm.
tragically. And so yeah, good friend of mine, and I still like to follow show steers, but none of my kids. We live in town in Ames, and so that was never anything that we did. But I was pretty into it at one time.
But you still have the passion for the
I,
livestock, I can tell.
I do. Yeah, as we'll talk about, I have a passion for cattle, so people get tired of me talking about that.
Oh, we love you for it. Uh, Matt, why don't you pull up your slides here and we can kind of
Yep.
get into a presentation you've been doing around the Midwest on nutrient reduction, kind of a hot topic at the moment.
Yep. Hopefully you can see that. And so yeah,
Perfect.
yep. I joke that in 2010 we started meeting about the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy, and one of my colleagues that was a little more advanced and has retired now said, if we're not careful, this will consume our professional careers for the rest of the time that we're in Iowa. And I joke that there probably hasn't been a day that's gone by since October of 2020 that I haven't thought about the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy in one way, shape, or form. since that point in time. And you know, a lot of good things I think have happened, but we really have a need to think about how we do more uh, within our agricultural landscape. And so that's kind of, you know, I think it's important for us to recognize the scale of, you know, why we have some of our problems and the scale of change that we need to achieve some of the goals that are out there.
Well, let's get right into it.
Okay. I will, so, you know, that's a picture of a wetland that we'll talk about as we go, but I think that's really one of the practices that has the potential to be put in on the Iowa landscape. And if you can see that picture, you know, there's not only are we removing nitrate with that wetland, but we're providing a lot of other benefits on the landscape as well. You know, there's waterfowl habitat, wildlife habitat, you know, you can see the flowering plants there. So pollinator habitat, maybe monarch habitat, as well as maybe some flow attenuation as we think about, you know, what we've seen in some areas this year with high rainfall, certainly more in central Iowa than maybe up in your landscape, Josh, or where my family is in far northwest Iowa. You know, they haven't gotten quite as much rain, but we've gotten quite a bit here in Ames.
I'll tell you what, Matt, down in Southwest Iowa, our farming operation is at, we've had, I want to say in the last 30 days, I'll have to go back and look at the updated numbers. It's like 17 or 18 inches of rain.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
more
just
more
been
than
incredible.
more than half the annual precip just in that period. Yeah, it seems like
Yes,
every storm is coming through southern Iowa and it kind of extends or yeah, southern Iowa and extends up into central Iowa and then, you know, not that far north and up into northeast Iowa. I know they've gotten a lot too.
it's been just, it's been it's been incredible. Not in a
Yeah.
good way.
So I think it's, you know, it's important to think about why we care about this from a water quality standpoint. And there are really a lot of reasons to care. And I think all, you know, these four pictures illustrate it pretty well. I think Assistant Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, Kay Stefanik, kind of put these together. And, you know, we have our streams and you can kind of see there, you know, when we get that precipitation and runoff, our streams can look pretty murky. Certainly if we have you know, situations where maybe low dissolved oxygen or maybe something else getting into our stream, we can see fish kills. And then those ones on the right, you know, if we have nutrients in our water bodies that can stimulate algae production, and that algae is you know nuisance. It could be you know microcystin, toxic algal blooms, but not something that we want to recreate in. And then certainly you know hot topic in the news these days is that lower right with our drinking water, and we can think about that both from you know large municipalities like Central Iowa Water Works, Des Moines Water Works, needing to treat the water that they're delivering to their customers, and they're able to do that. But as we think about, you know, smaller municipalities or private wells that might have nitrate in them, that's also a concern. And so there is a, you know, there's a drinking water standard, EPA drinking water standard of 10 milligrams per liter of nitrate as nitrogen. And so, you know, need to meet that. And, you know, at times, uh, you know, most notably in the news is Des Moines that the water they're pulling in, exceeds that 10 milligrams per liter. So they're needing to remove the nitrate out of that to deliver it to customers, meeting the EPA drinking water standard. Um, and so, you know, as we look at this in 2008, the hypoxia action plan. So there's a hypoxia task force that's made up of states along the main stem of the Mississippi River, as well as Indiana and Ohio. And that action plan called for states to develop comprehensive nitrogen and phosphorus reduction strategies, you know, in the Mississippi River Basin. And so the goal of that is to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus loading by 45%, ultimately reducing that phosphorus loading and nitrogen loading by 45%. One of the reasons is because in the summer months, there's a dead zone that's forming off the or in the Gulf, uh, and the increased size of that over time has been attributed to increased nutrient loading down the river. So those nutrients, kind of like that picture I had up there with the algae in a local water body. Algae is produced in the Gulf, and when that algae dies, it consumes oxygen, and so there's an area in the Gulf that is so low in dissolved oxygen it can't support aquatic life. So that's impacting the aquatic community, impacting the fishing industry, and so efforts underway across the Mississippi River Basin to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus loading down the river. So the goals of the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy are consistent with that, a 45% reduction. And really all states in the Mississippi River Basin, or all states in the hypoxia task force, have this same goal. And so in 2013, the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy was released. So we're, I guess, 13 years on with it. And as part of that, we at Iowa State University were involved with a science assessment to look at, where's the loading coming from and what would it take to reach the goals. And we estimated to reach those goals, we would need to reach 45% reduction in nitrogen. We'd need a 41% reduction from non-point sources and 4% from point sources. A little less on non-point on the phosphorus because there is a little bit more point source coming from our phosphorus. But that non-point source is primarily agriculture. And we need to recognize, we have 23 million acres of annual row crops in the state of Iowa. In a state of 36 million, we have 23 million acres of annual row crops. And as we'll talk about, I think that's the challenge that we face, is that we are a heavy agricultural state, heavy row crop production, and that tends to be a leaky system as we think about it, specifically from a nitrogen standpoint, a leaky system. We'll talk about kind of how the differences in how nitrogen and phosphorus move off the landscape.
Matt, on the task force, what states are all, or were all, or still are all involved in that?
Yeah. Okay. So now you're testing me to see if I can remember this. So we have Louisiana and Mississippi, Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin.
Okay.
I think 12 states. I think I got 12 states there.
That was really good.
Yeah.
I'm impressed. So each one of those states has had to put together a plan to get to this number. Is that right?
That's correct. That's correct. Yep. They all took a little different approach and so forth, but a lot of them did conduct a science assessment or are in the process still of doing that to look at kind of what it would take to reach those load reduction goals.
Something for us to talk about as we go through here is maybe how some of these other states have tried to tackle this.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
especially I think states like Minnesota and Illinois and Indiana.
Yep.
I states as we think
Yeah.
about, obviously Minnesota's not an I state, but
Yeah.
the I states as we think of them.
Yeah, because there's a lot of similarities in those states as we think about Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and parts of Ohio. Heavy row crop agricultural production, and as we'll talk about, heavily tile drained systems. Naturally poorly drained soils, and so there's a lot of similarities. So the practices that we'll talk about today are ones that are actively being looked at and implemented in those other states as well.
All right.
And actually, if folks want, there's a Great Lakes to Gulf website that does a really good job of kind of compiling. You can go to each state and find out information that they're doing. So, and people that are interested in things that are going on in each of the states, that Great Lakes to Gulf website, if you just search Great Lakes to Gulf website, should be able to find that.
I'll post that in
Okay.
the link when this thing is posted.
Okay, sounds good. So this looks at, this is USGS, the United States Geological Survey does monitoring at many locations in the basin, and they've from measured data calculated the annual total nitrogen loads to the Gulf. And so, there's monitoring that's going on to look at that. The reduction goal was a 20% reduction by 2025, 45% reduction by 2035. And so actually there's been at the mouth of the Mississippi, there's been some progress made in reducing that annual total nitrogen load to the Gulf. Now, I get asked a lot what's happening in Iowa. And I guess what I would say is, maybe it's a little bit of a good news, bad news situation. And so in Iowa, we have the data dashboard that we frequently update for what's going on in Iowa related to the nutrient reduction strategy. And one of the ones that frequently gets looked at is the water quality side. And so this looks at since 2020, or excuse me, since 2000, since 2000, what's from the measured data out there, what's the nitrogen load per inch of water flow? And I think it's important to kind of look at it that way we're normalizing it between wet and dry years. Wet years, we know there's a higher nitrogen load because there's more water flow. And so this is the end load in tons per inch of water flow. And so the blue line on there is that annual load, and you can see that varies, quite a bit. The green line on there is the 5-year moving average. And what we can see is that 5-year moving average is pretty similar over the last 20 years. So, it's it's been pretty stable in the 5-year moving average nitrogen load over that period. Now, we know this is through 2024. The most recent data that we have summarized from USGS, or excuse me, from the Iowa DNR on this. They do this summary using data that's been collected in the state. And we know that 2025 was a higher nitrogen load year. And we know what's happening in 2026, a higher nitrogen load year. So, I guess in a way, this is kind of a good news and a bad news situation. If we look at the nitrogen load in tons per inch of flow, we haven't gotten worse, but we haven't really gotten better over the last 2 decades. Now, I think it's interesting, based on what's in the news right now, to kind of look at Des Moines, Des Moines Waterworks, Central Iowa Waterworks, this nitrate issue that they're having, and certainly the lawn watering ban again here in 2026. So they have a great data record of almost daily nitrate concentration data that they've collected, Des Moines Waterworks, and that dates back into the 70s. And you can see that, we've had these elevated nitrate concentration, even dating back into the 70s. But, certainly a big concern here recently as well. So this one, the dots are the nitrate concentration. The green line is the flow that's happening at discharge that's being measured. This would be near Van Meter, Iowa, where the Raccoon River is, and after the South Raccoon has come in to the North Raccoon.
And they have their own water monitoring site there. Is that what you're saying?
There's a USGS site at Van Meter
Okay.
that this would be data consistent with that. Yeah. So I think it's been interesting to look at what's happened the last year or year plus. This is looking at Sac City, so a little bit up further on the North Raccoon, and so you can see that nitrate concentration at Sac City has been above 10 milligrams per liter, for over a year, almost consistently, other than when maybe there's been some specific flow periods. This is updated through almost April of this year. And it's been above 10 really since that point in time as well. So I certainly got asked some questions this last winter. Have we ever seen the nitrate concentrations above 10 during the winter months where, maybe we wouldn't expect it that way? And we did back in 2015 and 2016. And so this is looking at that same location, USGS station near Sac City. And you can see, from kind of all of 2015, we were above that 10 milligram per liter level at that station. And I think there's some similarities between 2015 and 2025. 2015 was just a couple years post drought of 2012, and 2025 was just a couple years post dry conditions from 2000 or 2020, sorry, 2020 through 2023. So, when we get those dry conditions, we don't leach much nitrate out of the profile. And so then when we get those subsequent precipitation events, we end up leaching a lot of nitrate out of the system. And it's made me think about what's that lag time. When we leach nitrate, we move some of it below the plant root zone and some of it below the drain line. And there may be an extended period of time before that water and nitrate gets to the stream. And so there's some lag time associated with that I think there's some really interesting research questions on. So, I think it's important to recognize, why do we have these problems? And, I think one of the things is that we can kind of look at what's happened in the state of Iowa over the last 100 years. And I think this is a really interesting graph. Um, Others may not find it very interesting, but, this is looking at from USDA what is, the historical changes in land use. And we can think about, corn, soybeans, oats are plotted here. And what's interesting is we've grown between 10 and 14 million acres of corn every year for the last 100 years. So, our corn acreage has been pretty stable over that whole period of time. But what's changed is that, if we look at 100 years ago, we didn't grow any soybeans, right? But we grew about 6 million acres of oats. We had a lot of hay ground, pasture ground, or more acres of hay and pasture and forage out there. And so we can see that, up until in the 50s, we still grew about 5 to 6 million acres of oats. But you can see that oat acres gradually declining until we, very few acres of oats now, and we've increased that soybean acres. So we've taken what was a more diverse landscape, something growing a greater percentage of the year, to now really dominated by corn, soybean, annual cropping system, where those crops are growing pretty much at the same time. And so, if we think about that, kind of April, May, and early June, we don't have much growing on the landscape. Certainly corn and soybeans are starting, but not a lot of growth of that, not a lot of nitrogen uptake of that system compared to what we would have had, maybe 100 years ago or 75 years ago out on the Iowa landscape. I bet if we drove from between Algona and Ames 100 years ago, we'd see, a lot of different things growing on the landscape than just corn and soybeans.
I remember talking to my grandpa who farmed just across the Iowa-Minnesota line there in southern Minnesota. And I mean, he grew quite a number of crops from wheat to oats to sugar beets
Yeah.
and waxy corn. And so to your point, yeah, greater array of crops for sure.
Yep. Yep. More diversity of crops. And I think the next slide will illustrate why that's important. Yes. Okay. I think this is, if somebody is listening to this maybe is the biggest take home point there is. And this is an illustration from my colleague here at Iowa State University, Dr. Mike Castellano. And so, we are really blessed in Iowa with the soils that we have, right? We have just beautiful soils developed under prairies, wetlands, swamps, areas. So we have a lot of natural organic matter and a lot of organic nitrogen that's in that soil. And so when those soils get warm and moist, we convert a portion of that organic nitrogen pool into the nitrate form. And that's what's illustrated by that red line. The green line illustrates the corn or soybean nitrate uptake. And so, if one looks at this, hopefully they see that there's a mismatch in that timing, right? And so we have those gray areas when there's not really a crop growing out there with our corn soybean rotation to take up nitrate that's in the soil profile. And so if we get excess precipitation during those periods, we are susceptible to nitrate leaching out of the soil profile. And so, one kind of guiding principle might be, how do we reduce that gray area? What can we do on the Iowa landscape to reduce that gray area? And, if we think back to more crop diversification, if we had a small grain growing out there, that green line might be shifted a bit to the left so that we're reducing the gray area during that time period. We can also think about cover crops that we might plant in the fall, and some of them may overwinter and grow into the spring. And those may help us reduce that gray area in the shoulder seasons, in the fall of the year or early winter or in the spring of the year. And so that's why cover crops could be so effective, is they could help us reduce some of that gray area in the spring or the fall. But I think this is really, an important point, that we have these soils that are so wonderful, but we do see that conversion of some of that organic nitrogen into the nitrate form, and then it's susceptible to loss when we get these excess precipitation events. And unfortunately, Josh, we think about it, when do we get these excess precipitation events? They're during those big gray areas, especially in the spring of the year. Our site near Gilmore City, we lose about 65 to 75% of the nitrate during April, May, and June, and that'd be kind of in that big gray area.
So you mentioned those two different possible solutions to that, Matt.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's an array. It's a multifaceted approach, as we
Yeah.
know. Another crop growing, whether that be a small grain and or cover crop.
Yep.
Obviously, one of them that comes to mind is rye. Very, very popular. It's one we use in our operation to be able to hold the soil, right? Of course, think of
Multiple
Southwest Iowa being able to
benefit.
hold the soil. Multiple benefits. Yeah.
Multiple benefits. Yep. Yep, that's exactly right. And I think, this is where we can start thinking about those multiple benefits, and then also thinking about how does nitrogen and how do nitrogen and phosphorus move off the landscape? And then we have to think about practices a little bit different. And so, this just illustrates kind of, the hydrologic cycle, for better or worse. And so, in Iowa, we have naturally well-drained soils and soils with poor natural drainage, right? And so, both of these, we get precipitation and we get evapotranspiration. In those soils with poor natural drainage, what we've done over the last 120 some years is we've installed subsurface drainage, as you're so well aware, and your family's well aware. It's made Iowa the leader that it is in agricultural production. It's really made those, as we think about those I-states in Minnesota, it's really made those the world leader they are in agricultural production, because because of that precipitation, we get that water table getting up to near the ground surface. We don't have air in the soil, and if we didn't have that drainage, that is. And so, we've installed this drainage network in there to take off that excess precipitation, some of that excess water, and take that water to the stream. Been very good from an agricultural production standpoint. But as we think about this, most of the nitrate that we lose from our annual cropping system is lost in that water kind of moving through the soil profile with that infiltration arrow. So, 90+% of the nitrate is moving through the soil and below the plant root zone. Now, if we don't have drainage, that can move to deeper groundwater or move through shallow lateral flow pathways to the stream, but we're still losing nitrate from that. It's just delivered to the stream or downstream water body in a different fashion. Where we have drainage, that water is being collected by the drainage network and exported to the stream. And so the drainage is a delivery mechanism of nitrate to the stream. That's kind of a good news and a bad news situation, right? It takes that nitrate to the stream, but as we'll talk about, we know where that nitrate is coming out, and we have a whole host of practices that we could implement to reduce that nitrate that's delivered to the stream with the drainage system. So in both these situations, we want to do the best job we can with infield nitrogen management or cover crops to reduce that nitrate leaching. But where we have tile drainage, we have a suite of practices we could use to intercept that tile line and treat that water before it gets to the stream. I mentioned the phosphorus. Kind of the majority of the phosphorus would be lost with that surface runoff. And so that's where it's different. The nitrate is primarily lost in water that's moving through the soil. Phosphorus, majority of that is what's lost in that surface water runoff. So that's why, things like cover crops can be effective for, taking up some of that nitrate to reduce that, but it also protects the soil surface for that surface runoff and phosphorus loss.
So it's solving both of those issues essentially.
Yeah. 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 That's why cover crops can be so effective. They're one of the few practices that can help us with both. I get a lot of questions about, no-till or reduced tillage. Absolutely, that can help us with reducing that phosphorus loss and surface runoff. But the research has indicated not consistently reducing nitrate loss in that drainage water. And so, we need to do the best we can with infield management from a tillage perspective, but it's probably going to do much more for us on phosphorus than it is on nitrate.
Yeah, maybe a fun history lesson
Yeah,
for folks as well about drainage in Iowa. I believe Iowa spent more money on drainage tile infrastructure back at the turn of the 20th century than the United States spent building the Panama Canal.
that's right. They can look up. There's a New York Times article that equated, yeah, more private investment in drainage in 19 by 1914 in Iowa than the U.S. investment in the Panama Canal. So this infrastructure is extensive in the states, specifically in the area you live, the Des Moines lobe of Iowa. And it's something that we need to recognize is out there. And something I think that we can think about how we integrate drainage with some of these edge of field practices and think about the future of how we integrate that for water quality benefit, as well as I'll talk about, there might even be some aspects where there might even be some additional production benefits.
Had to throw that point in there, Matt.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's super important, and and back then it was really backbreaking labor. It's been improved a lot since then in how we install drainage tile.
I just think of those folks being able to lay that by hand and to lay it on
Yes.
grade as well as they did, and it is quite an engineering feat when you're out in the field and seeing that.
Yeah, and some of those big drainage mains that were installed 100 years ago are still functioning, to their design capacity. Now they're undersized now based on, modern design standards, but they're still functioning and providing agricultural benefits out on the landscape.
Yeah, just incredible. Yeah,
It
like
is. Yeah.
Dad will run into different clay mains, and it's the concrete mains too, I guess, and it's yeah, like I said, it's just an engineering feat. And to think of, hand digging that and then laying that, and then, like I said, making sure that they put it on the correct grade in order
Yes.
to drain the area they were trying to drain. It's
Yeah,
just, it
without,
really isn't
you think
anything.
about it without some of the modern,
Oh,
surveying tools and GPS and grade control. So yeah, it's an engineering feat. That's exactly right. Yeah. Um, so so this one, we really do have a lot of practices that we could use to reduce nitrate that's lost from our cropping system. Things like the 4 R's, nutrient management, are so important. Cover crops, and then we'll talk about some of these edge of field practices. And certainly, as we think about some of the programs, we mentioned cattle before, but Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship has kind of a cattle and conservation working lands program where they're looking at, maybe more marginal land, unprofitable land, or highly erodible land. How do we maybe get that back into pasture production? That could really help us reduce that nitrate leaching from that system. So you'll see grazed pasture has a big nitrate reduction associated with it. You know, One of our challenges, though, is that a lot of those 4R practices are more in the single or low double digits for nitrate reduction. So we're talking about, 0 to 10 to 15% reduction with with those. And that's our challenge, is that we need to make improvements with nitrogen management, but that alone is really unlikely from the science to get us that 40%, 45%, or 41% reduction. So that's why we need things like cover crops and the edge of field practices we'll talk about. But I think this illustrates we have a lot of tools in our toolbox to reduce nitrate that's being lost from the plant root zone or delivered to a downstream water body.
well, that's, in order to, different parts of the state have different farming practices,
It-
as you're well aware. I'm very
yeah,
well aware. And it's, being able to, like I said, it's a multifaceted approach to be able to fit the operation and make sure that, the operation is not, is profitable, but also can meet these, bigger goals.
that you're exactly right. And as we'll talk about with these edge of field practices that treat tile drainage, those are only applicable in the tile drained landscape. But as we get to southern Iowa, or southwest Iowa, where there's a lot less tile drainage, more naturally well-drained soils, then those suite of practices are different, or what may work as well are different. And so we do need to recognize it's not really a one size fits all approach. Some of these infield practices could be used everywhere. I think cover crops are a practice that could be used everywhere, but may work best in areas, or they may be most economical in areas where maybe there's a forage need for cattle. So yes, that's exactly right. It's not a one size fits all approach, and we need to think about what's the agricultural system there and what practices might work best for that operation and that landscape.
And even that particular watershed as well, Matt.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's exact for sure. That we can think about, what may work for, we can think about what may work for the North Raccoon may not be as applicable in the South Raccoon, where there's a little more topography, a little bit more, maybe a little less, row crop agricultural production. So yeah, we can kind of take a watershed approach of looking at, what practices may be best suited for that specific watershed. So in a way, we need to tailor this menu of practices for the watershed that we're working in.
Yeah. Yeah. It just makes sense to me. Like I said, the farming practices that are happening and up here in north central Iowa compared to, what we do in southwest Iowa, very different, right?
Yep. Yep, for sure. For
As
sure.
we say, as they say up in northern Iowa, it's turn and burn. And in southwest Iowa, we've got terraces that we farm around and
Yeah, that's right.
other fun infrastructure. In order to, keep the soil in place, that's terraces have been a practice that have been around for thousands of years, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yep. And really, really one of the practices we really want to use and have on the landscape specifically for that reducing soil loss and phosphorus. So yeah, really, important practices out there. So, as we think about this, I kind of already highlighted this, that, the our nutrient management and land use are really going to work on both tile drained and untiled or undrained landscapes. But then we have this whole host of edge of field practices that we can use on those tile drained landscapes. So I'm gonna jump to, nobody wants to see these. Here we go. I'm gonna jump to thinking about some of these practices and maybe how well they perform, and also thinking about um, highlighting again why we have some of the challenges we do. So this is data that from near Gilmore City. So we're going on, I guess this is our 37th year of continuous monitoring at a drainage water quality research site near Gilmore City, Iowa. Been
Wow.
really fortunate. I've not been involved all that time, but my predecessors at Iowa State University were, and really uh, appreciative to the funding that the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship has provided for this. One of the things in the Groundwater Protection Act in the late 80s, there was um, one of the things that was done was there's a small tax on fertilizer, um, the ag management account, and those a portion of those funds have gone to IDOLs, and IDOLs have invested a lot of those funds in research to look at water quality, and that's this project site has been a part of that. Some of those funds also went to the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture for a period, and now to the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. So, I always like to say those dollars that farmers have paid to that fertilizer tax have really gone toward us better understanding some of these water quality issues that we have. So this one is, we have 10 years of data with winter cereal rye cover crop. And over that 10-year period, we reduced nitrate loss out of the drainage system by 110 pounds per acre. So over that period, about 11% or 11 pound per acre reduction per year. So on average, we lost about 30 pounds per acre per year from our corn soybean cropping system, and we reduced it about 111 pounds when we had that cover crop. And what I like to say is this was not like thigh or chest high cover crops. This was us doing the cover crops, and Carl Peterson doing the cover crops, and he does a good job. But we didn't get the best growth like you see in some of the Facebook feeds and some of that. This is, I think, pretty reasonable for what about any farmer could get. And we still saw, 111 pound reduction over that 10-year period. So I think, when some people say, well, you're doing research and this is, you're too optimistic on it. I think this is pretty reasonable because there were some years we had very little growth just because of the weather, and we still saw pretty substantial reduction.
To your point on that, Matt, let's delve into that just a little bit on the
Yeah.
research facility, because that's up here in northern Iowa,
Hmm.
right? So your growing
Yep.
season. I know the success that we've had down in southwest Iowa. Of course, it's a longer growing season, right?
Yep.
So you're able to go and get the rice seeded without too much of an issue, depending on
Yep.
the year. And the warm up happens, and you can get a really nice stand of
Yes.
rye.
Yep.
So my question is, how were you seeding this
Yeah.
up,
Yeah.
right? Because I just think of Mother Nature can put you behind the eight ball, especially up here, and then you can get an early freeze.
Yep.
And how, so the years you didn't have much growth, were was the plant like 3 or 4 inches tall?
Yeah, okay, that great question. So actually, those first 5 years, we drilled it in after harvest of the corner beans. So it was
Okay.
about, you know, October 15th to October 25th was when we were doing it. And there were a couple years where we got hardly any growth, not even an inch or two. In fact, that we were collecting biomass both in the fall and the spring. And I still remember I got a, text from our research group, and they said, well, there's no biomass to collect in the fall because it was
Mhm.
just so small to collect. But then we did get the growth in the spring. That would be the advantage of winter cereal rye. Um, the last 5 years in this period, we actually interseeded that. Um, and not aerial seeding, but actually hand seeding. So our way on these small plots of interseeding, and that was done kind of right after Labor Day. And I would say in a number of those years, probably 2 out of the 5, we got better growth than we had when we had drilled it because we got some timely rains. We had a little bit more, growing degree days or a growing window there. But there's still, we were still uh, at the uh, dependent upon Mother Nature. And so there were a couple years where we didn't get much growth because we didn't get much rain, after that seeding. And so, I recognize the challenge there. That drilling, it did allow you to get that seed below ground. So maybe there's a little more moisture there. So, again, this was, there were some years where we didn't get much growth. So, some might ask, well, how did you manage it in the spring? So we were killing it about 10 days to 2 weeks before corn planting and kind of right at or right after soybean planting.
Okay. I know
So,
growing, most of us are fairly hesitant to grow rye in front of our corn crop because it's a
yeah,
fellow grass plant.
yep, yep,
Um, just a notation on that part of it.
yep.
But you guys were using ryegrass on this. That was your predominant. There was no
It was.
other species in this, correct? That was just a
In
single.
this one, nope, winter cereal rye is all
Okay.
we used. Yep, winter cereal
Okay.
rye. And so, as I think about it, if um, you know, even if we could get all the acres going to soybeans with cover crop, recognizing that some producers maybe are concerned about the risk before corn, but even if we just did it before soybeans, that could be very beneficial in the long run.
Okay. Were you pleasantly surprised with the results you saw here?
Yes, yes.
I think a really
It,
important point to hit on is how much Mother Nature plays into some of the success of this in general, just because, like you said, some of it you got just barely any growth, and some of you probably were
yep,
shocked at how good it did grow.
yep. Yeah, I was. And one of the things that I think is super important to think about this, Josh, is and I jumped over this, but you bring it up that we have to recognize kind of the role Mother Nature plays in this. And so we talked about before kind of that nitrate loss following a drought. And so, this is looking at uh, the top circles are our combined corn soybean cropping system, the flow weighted annual nitrate concentration. And so you can see in 2013, we jumped from like 13 and a half to 22 milligrams per liter. But that jump was less, and we were able to maintain, lower nitrate where we had that cover crop, that it was very good at scavenging that residual nitrate that was within the soil profile after the drought of 2012, so that we didn't see as much increase in 2013. And we've kind of seen it similar in 2024 and 2025, kind of post those dry conditions from 2020 to 2023. So in a way, this cover crop, kind of helps us deal with uh, uh, some of those um, weather pattern that Mother Nature throws at us.
But it helped mitigate it
Yeah,
even
yeah,
with that. I mean, fairly substantially from what I'm seeing here.
fairly substantially. That's exactly right. Yep, yep. Um, so one of the things that I've often got questions about is, well, Matt, what was nitrate loss from a prairie? Because if we think back to the red line and green line, we have the same soil there. And so that red line might be similar, but our green line is going to be different. When that prairie is growing is different. And so we have a site near Ames, where in 2008 we went in and put a new drainage system in. So this is a restored prairie, but we have drainage plots there. So 2008, we put it in. 2008, 8 plots were seeded to prairie. 8 of 24 plots were seeded to prairie. Subsequent to that, four of those plots received nitrogen fertilizer to try to maximize above ground biomass. And this is looking at the cumulative nitrate loss from 2010 through 2022. And the solid line is continuous corn. The blue dashed line is continuous corn with cover crop. So you can see we did get a reduction there, even though it's continuous corn, and so we don't get as much growth of that cover crop in the spring of the year. So we would expect that to be on the lower end of the reduction. But we saw about a 95% reduction when we had prairie out there, even when we fertilized that prairie. So if we look at the nitrate concentration over that period, it was, a little below 10 with continuous corn, about 7 with continuous corn with cover crop, and less than about zero point 0.5 or about 0.5 when we had prairie or fertilized prairie. So this just gets at, I think it illustrates kind of why we have the challenges that we do, is that we have an annual cropping system where once there was a perennial. And we kind of need to recognize that challenge that we are faced with, and that our corn soybean cropping system tends to be a leaky system out there.
So what I'm seeing there, so if you're talking, the prairie, fertilized prairie, so are you talking, strategically placing wetlands in certain areas in specific watersheds in order to help mitigate some of that, Matt? Was that,
Yeah,
again,
yeah,
we're talking multifaceted approaches here with your cover crops amongst other practices, but I'm also seeing this as uh one of the multifaceted solutions too.
yeah. And so, one of the practices that we've been involved with is prairie strips, where we're strategically siting prairie like within a watershed or within a field. And so, we might put 10% of that field into prairie, and we would expect to see, at least about a 10% reduction in nitrate leaching and loss from that field just by the conversion to prairie. And then if that prairie intercepts any shallow groundwater, we would expect further nitrate removal from that system as well. So,
So
um,
the prairie strip on that example, would that be, as you're looking at the topography of how that land lays, would that be where our traditional, I'm just thinking of a grass waterway? Is that where
so
you strategically place it there, or how are you going about placing
yeah,
that?
great question. So we probably will still want a grassed waterway, but then these prairie strips would go perpendicular to the direction of water flow to kind of slow that water flow as it moves down the slope and maybe to the grassed waterway. So a grassed waterway, where it's more designed to convey water than slow down water. And so the prairie strips would be along the contour to slow that water flow down as it's moving down the slope. So we're reducing nitrate leaching where the prairie is, and then we're slowing runoff down as well as it moves down the slope to a grass waterway. And so in some areas, putting in that prairie strip might be similar in effectiveness to a terrace and maybe lower cost as well. And it may provide other benefits. They found that they can be, habitat for pollinators, and maybe provide some habitat for birds and some other things that are desirable. So I think there's some real benefits to that. These plots, I just want to be clear, these plots right here, where we saw the 95% reduction, that whole plot was converted to prairie. So it was what was lost below the plant root zone just from that prairie area.
Yeah, when you were talking the prairie strips in my mind, it either went to like I said, a grass waterway or a terrace infrastructure.
Yeah.
So these, what prairie strip, is that something that would be placed again in more of a highly erodible situation than you would say in a place up here in the Des Moines lobe that's very, very flat?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think they're going to be most effective, in areas where there's a little more slope. Certainly they would work, they would kind of work anywhere. So, even in the Des Moines lobe, we get some erosion at times, but yeah, they're probably best suited for a little bit more sloping land. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Yep. Um, Maybe the next one I want to illustrate that I think kind of gets at this is, and maybe illustrates why, why infield fertilizer management will only get us part of the way there. So we looked at corn soybean system. This was in O'Brien County, so northwest Iowa at one of the research farms there. We looked at fall nitrogen, spring nitrogen, split nitrogen, and then no nitrogen. And so um, what we saw at that site was, really no difference between fall, and this was a fall ammonia with an inhibitor that was put on when soils were 50 degrees and cooling, spring pre-plant ammonia. The split nitrogen was urea at planting or right before planting, and then actually was put on with the planter, and then polycoated urea in season.
Okay.
And so we did see if we split apply nitrogen, we saw a reduction in nitrate concentration, about a 15% reduction in that. What was interesting and consistent with other research we've done is that even when we applied no nitrogen to a corn soybean cropping system, and these same plots received no nitrogen over this whole study period, we still saw about 7 to 8 milligrams per liter of nitrate nitrogen in that tile line, even with no nitrogen to our corn soybean cropping system. So we only saw about a 40% reduction in nitrate, even when we applied no nitrogen to corn in that system. So it kind of illustrates that red line and green line I talked about before, because that red line is that kind of natural mineralization. And, that's what's supplying nitrogen for that corn crop with no N there. But we still have some nitrate in the system that's susceptible to loss. We
That's
certainly
just
saw corn yield decline when we applied no nitrogen. 70 to 100 bushel per acre decrease in corn yield, but we still saw that nitrate concentration 7 to 8 milligrams per liter.
and that's just because of I mean, you figure this when you look at your percent of organic matter within your
Yes,
soil because that has natural N in it. And that's what you're
that's
saying. It's like that's just because we have such rich soils here,
yep.
that's the natural release of that nitrogen.
Natural,
So,
that's right. Natural release. And then if we get rainfall at a time, if we get rainfall at that period when we've had that natural release and maybe not a lot of uptake by the corn or soybean cropping system, it's susceptible to loss. So, it kind of illustrates why we need some of these other practices out there as well.
in my mind, I'm just kind of coming back to it certainly seems, again, there is no magic bullet, different farming practices in different parts of the state. I'll go back to that again and again, but it certainly seems the cover crops seem to mitigate a lot of these issues
They,
you're talking about, Matt.
they do. They absolutely do.
It
And
seems
I
like the
think
research that you've put in front of me today, that seems, again, like I said, multifaceted, but it also seems like that one, it definitely helps mitigate a lot of this.
it really does. It really does. But we have to recognize that there's, there's challenges to cover crops, right? I mean,
Of
there's
course, oh,
challenges
no doubt.
yeah, and that's the issue, and there is a cost associated with cover crops. If we're in areas where there's livestock or the livestock need forage, grazing those cover crops can be very effective and might tip that to economically viable or economically beneficial. But outside of that, there is a cost associated with the seed, with seeding it and
Totally.
termination. But it is absolutely one of the practices I think that can help us reduce that nitrate leaching at the field scale.
Matt, on this chart here specifically,
Yeah.
I guess I'm surprised, and I guess my question to you would be, are you a little surprised as well on the, I certainly would have thought the split of your N would have, not that it didn't reduce it, because it obviously did,
Yeah.
but I would have thought it would have been at a higher rate.
Yeah. I think so. I'm not completely surprised because, there's only kind of there's only so much reduction we can get, right? Because we're not going to get below the no N probably. And so we're still applying nitrogen in that system. And, that nitrogen, not all of that may be used, by the corn crop. And so it may be susceptible to leaching that following spring, before soybeans. So not completely surprised. Um, Now, one of the things that will often get asked about this is, are you surprised between the fall and the spring? And I would say no, just because of the data we've collected on other sites, but there's some caveats to this. One is we applied that fall nitrogen when the soils were 50 degrees and cooling. We're at a part of the state where we don't get as much winter drainage, and maybe things don't thaw out as early in the spring as, say, southeast Iowa. I might expect a greater, or expect some reduction in nitrate concentration between fall and spring in southeast Iowa compared to northwest Iowa. The other factor is we applied the same rate in the fall and the spring. Now, if a producer applied more in the fall compared to the spring, I might expect higher nitrate concentrations with that fall applied nitrogen, as much because of the rate effect as the timing effect.
Okay.
And then, I don't have it in here, but one of the things I think that we, need to think about is that there's some of the nutrient resources that are put on earlier in the fall than maybe is advantageous. And so probably, there's probably some liquid swine manure that goes on. I know there is, uh, before the soils are 50 degrees and cooling, and there would be a risk of that, um, the nitrogen in there converting into the nitrate form and maybe being susceptible to loss, because when the soils are warmer than 50 degrees, we can see more of that conversion into the nitrate form of the nitrogen in the system. And so, thinking about how we can get some of our nutrient application as late in the fall as possible can be advantageous for us from a nitrate leaching perspective.
Okay. That's important.
So, yeah, I think we talked about the infield practices. Now we're going to talk about drainage, Josh, and what we can do in the drain landscape. And we have, I think, a lot of things. So, again, that nitrate's exported with the drainage system, but let's intercept that and try to treat that nitrate before it's delivered to the stream. And so we have, one is a bioreactor, a denitrification bioreactor. So we're digging a trench, and we're routing drainage water, or a portion of the drainage water, through there. We're putting some type of carbon media in there. In most cases, it's wood chips. There's some work looking at corn cobs, and we're going to promote denitrification in that trench, so that we're converting a portion of the nitrate into dinitrogen gas, so that the water that's delivered downstream is lower in nitrate. So this trench might be, 20 foot wide, 100 foot long, might treat 80 to 100 acres with one of these bioreactors.
Is that fairly effective at getting the nitrate level down? Like
Yeah,
fairly
yep.
low?
That we might expect between a 30 and 50% nitrate reduction with this. So I think that's, pretty effective. Yep. Now, one of the challenges here is that this one does require maintenance, that at some point in time, we're going to have to replenish that carbon media, wood chips or corn cobs. And so this one's going to have some ongoing maintenance, maybe every 10 to 15 years, to replace that carbon media.
Okay.
Um, Another one would be the saturated buffers, where in this case, we're going to put a control structure in. We're going to route a portion of that drainage along the upstream edge of the buffer and promote shallow groundwater flow, promote denitrification below the buffer or some plant uptake. And so again, we might be able to reduce nitrate delivery, 30 to 50% with the water going through that saturated buffer. So pretty cost effective too, because this one, there's not that ongoing maintenance of replacing wood chips. The cost is primarily with that structure that you see there and a lateral line along the upstream edge of that buffer. Um, and one of my favorites is going back to the picture in my first slide. And so here is a picture of a conservation reserve enhancement program wetland. So this is a program that's been worked on for about over 20 years. Most of these initially were put in in a partnership between the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship and the Farm Service Agency through the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. IDALS is really expanding this effort now. But in this case, we're going to intercept surface water that is primarily surface water from a tile line, a big drainage main. So in this case, those last two practices are more field scale, like 80 to 100 acres. Now we're talking about maybe 500 to 5,000 acres of water coming into one location, and we're going to put this wetland in. And if that wetland pool is about 1% of the contributing area. So if we have 1,000 acres coming in, the wetland pool is maybe 10 acres. Long-term monitoring and modeling that Dr. Bill Crumpton at Iowa State has done would estimate long-term that would be expected to remove about 50% of the nitrate coming into it. And then we might have a couple more percent of land in the buffer around that wetland, but it's really, for 3 to 4% of the landscape, we might be able to remove 50% of the nitrate coming from up above. And as I talked about, may provide a lot of other benefits on the landscape.
Yeah, like you said, with pollinators and
Yeah.
wildlife and
Yeah.
those kind of things as well.
Yeah. And, now, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, right? But maybe some aesthetic value on the landscape, some recreational value of just going down by the wetland and relaxing. So I think there's a lot of benefits. And in a way, we're reintroducing wetlands into an area of the country that was, once dotted with wetlands or dominated by wetlands on the landscape. And then the last one, and here's where we get into the ag engineering side and the emerging side of things, is what about if we captured that drainage water, stored it, and then reuse that for supplemental irrigation for our crops? So, I'd say a lot of years farmers would like to have an inch or two of rain or 3 or 4 in August each year. Well, what if we stored that drainage water, we kept those nutrients from going downstream, and we use that for supplemental irrigation? And we found we might be able to get a 10 to 50 bushel yield benefit with this long term. Now, is that enough to pay for this whole system? That's where the challenge comes in, that it can be pretty expensive for the storage and for the irrigation system. But compared to some of the other edge of field practices, this one might have a direct benefit to the producer as well. Maybe, and as we think about linking some of these things, if we had that irrigation out there, we might be able to make sure our cover crops gets going in the fall as well. We're looking at relay intercropping. And one of the challenges with that, where we're trying to get 3 crops in 2 years. And so we're trying to get a small grain and soybeans off in the same year. And we may see water limitation with those soybeans. And so if we could have irrigation for those soybeans late in the season, it could provide benefits. So I think this is feasible. Whether it's cost effective is what we're really trying to look at right now.
Matt, does this kind of system here, just putting my drainage hat on,
Yeah.
specifically I'm guessing the farm has to have a certain type of topography in order to make this work, or not necessarily?
So I would say not necessarily, although um, so we are doing studies on three sites. One near Story City, one near Dayton, and one near Lake City. And all of those have a little different topography and a little different way that they're capturing water. So one of them is a pretty flat landscape, and they took a corner of the field that was pretty wet. They're pumping out of the drainage main into and a storage basin was constructed there. So they're pumping out of the drainage main into the storage basin and then pumping out of the storage basin to the center pivot irrigation. The site over near Lake City was topography where there was some drainage coming from about 1,200 acres down through an area that wasn't being cropped. That was bermed, and so there was no land out of production. They were able to berm that, and so that has a supply of water, and they're able to pump and irrigate about 55 acres there. So, but that one, I would say a lower cost reservoir because there was no land taken out of production. Okay. The third site again was one where they didn't take any land out of production. It was a corner of a field that was not cropped, and they were able to berm that and able to get water into that. And so, not every farm is probably going to have an area that's really well suited for storage, or an area. Yeah, not every farm's going to have an area well suited for storage, but I think there are a lot of farms that would have sites where maybe they're poor producing areas, or there's a draw that areas that's not being cropped. So I think there's some potential here at least to for this to scale up, and we would expect greater crop production benefits if we have areas that might have sandier soils.
That makes perfect sense. How many acres of production? Obviously, it depends on the project, but how many acres would you have to take out of production in order to make this work roughly?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I'm from the university, so I'm going to say it depends, but it does. So it'd kind of be that we have to think about storing somewhere between 3 to 6 inches of water. And so whatever kind of area that we need to effectively store 3 to 6 inches of water. So if we have a system that's really good soils, we probably are looking at that 3 inches of water. So our site near Dayton, if we can get 3 inches of water, that's what it was designed for, and that's about what we would need. Our site near Lake City, sandier soils, if we can store that one is more toward that being able to have storage for 6 inches of water. And I would say we are still learning. This is really an active area of research, probably, one of my more active areas of research.
Okay. So kind of on the tip of the spear here, as we'd
Tip of
like.
the spear, exactly. Yeah, I don't want anybody to go out and, well, I mean, they could, but for this to think about this on a broad scale, I think we want to learn a little bit more about it on, what can we expect for yield benefits? Is there enough to offset all of this construction? Are there some incentive dollars because we are seeing, we're storing that water and keeping those nutrients from going downstream.
Right. And then being able to
Not,
use the water when you need it as well.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
there's a lot to be
yeah,
said about that.
yeah, and learning about, yeah, there's a lot of information on irrigation in the West, or the Western Corn Belt, less here. The thing is, you don't want to use all of your irrigate. If you have 3 inches or 5 inches to use, you don't want to use it all in July, right? And then not have it in August. But you also, if you get a flash drought in June, you might want to use some to get that crop through. So it's a bit of a balancing act, I would say.
Again, Mother Nature rules the roost.
It does. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah. But I think this one, could become more important in the future. Some of the projections are wetter springs and drier summers. So this may provide us more resilience on in the agricultural system, because we'd be able to store some of that spring rainfall and reuse it in the summer where maybe we need more of it.
Hmm. For sure, definitely.
So, um, yeah, if somebody wants, there's the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy tracking dashboard they can go to, and um, you can find the science assessment. And I'd say I have a cure for insomnia. Print it out, put it by your bedside, read one page a night for 200 nights, and you're asleep after one page. Um, But one of the things that I think is important is to just think about the scale of change that we need in the state of Iowa. And so this is going back to the original Iowa nutrient reduction strategy that came out in 2013. And this is just an example. So, there's no hard scenario for the state, but they're, example of what it might take. And, completely recognize that Iowa State's decision support tool for nitrogen has changed since 2013. Now there's the NFAC tool that's out there as part of the Iowa Nitrogen Initiative. But we can kind of think about this, that we need to do the best job we can with nitrogen management, both on commercial fertilizer and manure. And in this scenario, and as I said, just one scenario, but just to illustrate the scale, and that we need a combination of practices like we've talked about so much. So this one, best job with N management, and 60% of our acres with cover crops, and about 7.5 million acres treated with wetlands, and about 6 to 7 million acres treated with bioreactors or saturated buffers. So that should say bioreactor or saturated buffers. At the time of the nutrient reduction strategy, there was no saturated buffer. It was still being researched. So, and those are ands and not ors. It's not, you know, 60% of the acres with cover crops. It's 60% of the acres with cover crops and wetlands and bioreactors or saturated buffers. And that's a big, we have 23 million acres. We need to think about it. We almost need to do something on all 23 million of those acres in one way, shape, or form, which is big, and I think also tough even for me to wrap my arms around the scale of change that we need.
Wow. Yeah. I'm just digesting what
Okay.
you just said. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but as we think about this, some of the questions I wrestle with is, and I think this has been said a lot this year, we need to accelerate adoption. How do we do more on the landscape? And I think there are important questions to ask and wrestle with is, how do we pay for this? Who pays for it? How do we create that sense of urgency? Are there opportunities for other crops or land uses? And that's where, I think the cattle and conservation program is so effective. But, as we think about scaling this up, and accelerating adoption, we're going to need more individuals doing work on this, right? That's workforce development opportunities. People working within the rural landscape on these practices, maybe maintaining them, helping farmers get them implemented, constructing them for land improvement contractors, right? Wetlands, drainage water recycling, bioreactors, saturated buffers, drainage water or land improvement contractors are going to be doing that type of work. So I think that, we can look at this as the scale of change is huge, and it is, and we need to think about how we accelerate adoption. But those dollars that somebody invests in this is going back into our rural communities. And I think that's great. I'm at an educational institution. It's great when our graduates can go out and do work in Iowa to benefit Iowans. And I think there's more opportunity for that now in this space, in the kind of the land and water resource space, than there's ever been. And as I talked about, kind of opportunities for, you know, those land improvement contractors, agronomists, conservation agronomists that may be working with farmers. So I think there's some real, I'm not, people don't ever accuse me of being an optimist. I call myself a realist. Lots of people call me a pessimist, but this is where like I'm optimistic if we can think about ways to accelerate that adoption and get more out there. There's some real development or workforce, opportunities out there.
Yeah, I think that's an important point that sometimes we get into the one or the other, and I think
Yeah.
there's opportunities all over the place here to help conserve that topsoil, improve water quality,
Yep.
improve the rural landscape, which is I think those are all goals that I think everybody in the state of Iowa is behind. So I think, like you
Yeah.
said, there's
I mean, I
opportunity.
think that I think so many people can agree on that we want to protect, one of Iowa's most vital assets, which is our topsoil, right? And
100%.
and doing more to protect that. I found Jonathan Coppice, they talked to, really interesting about, let's think about it. How do we protect that soil? So that is super important. I think nearly everybody, so many agree that we want to have clean water for a host of factors. So I think there's a lot of agreement on these issues. Where there's challenges is how do we get the scale of change that's needed to see those improvements that we ultimately want. And I think that's where, you know, kind of reiterating things we've talked about is we need it all. It's not just one size fits all. It's we need nitrogen management. We need cropping practices and land use. We need edge of field practices. And we need to be, thinking about where is the best place to implement those. Wetlands and bioreactors and saturated buffers in the Des Moines Lobe, Cedar River Basin, are great. But, you know, let's prioritize maybe other practices down in southern or southwest Iowa where, you know, where maybe there's a greater forage need for cover crops, right? Or the land is suited for pasture land, and that's a really productive use of that. So um, I think we need to do that. We need to think about ways to increase the rate of implementation. I think that's, really been talked about a lot this year is how do we increase that rate? We need to do it. There's some good examples of trying to do that with batch and build, other efforts, but we need to continue to do more of that. And, I'll just use a phrase my colleague Dan Anderson uses a lot. I'll say he coined it. Somebody else might have, but he uses it as much as anybody, which is ABG. We need to always be growing. Thinking about how we have something growing on the landscape a greater percentage of the year, and that provides so many benefits for us.
Well, Matt, this has been a great conversation. You're full of knowledge. Appreciate all the things that Iowa State's doing, what you're doing, and just educating all of us on all of this stuff. And where can people find you if they want to look you up?
They can find me. There's my email address, mhelmers@iastate.edu. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm not on X anymore, so I'm not there. You can email me. You can Google me and find information. I would encourage you go to the Iowa Nutrient Research Center website if you want to know some of the research that's going on at Iowa State, done by others. Please go to the Iowa Nutrient Research Center website. I'll put another couple plugs in is that, if you're interested in these topics, we host the Iowa Learning Farms in kind of in collaboration with the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, host a weekly webinar series, noon every Wednesday, 50 weeks a year. So we don't do it over the Christmas holiday, but we do 50 webinars a year on conservation topics. So if you go to the Iowa Learning Farms website, you can find information about the webinar. I bet there would be one that would be of interest to folks. We've, they're the best part of my week when I get to moderate those and help host those. So I'd encourage you to do that. We also do a monthly seminar during the academic year for the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, more of an hour-long, a longer form kind of event. And this fall, we may be looking at kind of nutrient reduction efforts in other countries, what they're doing around this. So, I'm Josh, I think you and I might have this in common that we like history, right?
Love it.
So when I start something new, I always look at what have others done in this space? Where have others had success or maybe lack thereof? And so, I kind of want to look at what have others done on nutrient reduction efforts in different countries, just to maybe compare and contrast to what we're doing here in the U.S. and maybe what's been successful for them and what hasn't. So tune into that. Keep on the lookout for that. The Iowa Nutrient Research Center website will have that. So I'm pretty easy to get in touch with, I think, and try to, I guess, do the best I can to disseminate information out there.
For sure. To speak of nerding out a little bit, I'm in the midst of reading Henry French's treatise on drainage, 1859 edition, Matt. So,
Oh, really? Andre?
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I want to say this another, like geeking out on drainage, I guess. Um, uh, a few years ago, 2021 was it? We held the International Drainage Research Symposium or International Drainage Symposium in Des Moines, Iowa. And one of our featured speakers was Rob Burtenshaw, that's a contractor in England. And he commented, he said, he had made a visit to the States on a Nuffield fellowship to tour drainage in the States a few years before this. And he said, when I was in Iowa or the Midwest, you all talked about hitting old clay tile that was 100 years old. I hit tile from the Roman age, Roman
Right.
Empire. So, that some of this has been around an awful long time, and we've been draining, some of the debates about drainage. Um, it, some of the debates about drainage were first talked about in an Institute of Civil Engineers in 1861 in London. So, there's been,
Yes.
drainage has been around a long time, talked about a long time. So, it's super important for our agricultural production. And I think super important for us to think about in the future is how do we do the best job we can with integrating some of those edge of field practices in with drainage redesign.
Yeah. No doubt about that. No, that'll be a conversation for us next time, Matt, on the history
That sounds great.
of drainage tile. I think that's
Yeah,
kind of it's an important but interesting point too. Yeah, this goes back thousands of
yeah,
years.
the history. There are a couple folks that have done PhDs on the history of drainage in different areas. So that's a whole another topic.
Yes, we'll say that for next time.
Yeah.
Matt, thanks again. Appreciate your time and expertise. And this is Josh Mansky with the Corn Belt Newsletter Podcast, and we'll see everybody next time.